This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our guest today, Ms. Dena Merriam. She is the founder and convener of the Global Peace Initiative of Women. Ms. Merriam began working in the interfaith movement in the late 1990s when she served as the vice chair of the Millennium World Peace Summit of Religious and Spiritual Leaders held at the United Nations in New York. Dena, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today.
Happy to be here.
Dena, let's go back to some of the origins of the work you do. You're a longtime yogi and spiritual practitioner, and at a certain point, you started the Global Peace Initiative of Women, and were involved in the UN. Tell us a little bit about how that all came to be, how you became to be a spiritual activist, essentially.
Well, I came to my spiritual path when I was very young, 20, when I came upon the teachings of my guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, and became a serious meditation practitioner and leader of many of the great Vedic texts, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. You're really a student of that worldview. And then about 20 years later, I really kind of, in an unplanned way, got involved in organizing this big summit at the United Nations of religious leaders. And I was a little resistant because I had turned away from organized religion and was just a quiet yogi, seeking my own understanding of the world, of reality, pursuing my meditation practice. I was a single mom raising my kids. And then I had this opportunity to organize this summit. And it was a huge deal, first time the UN ever did this. And in the process of organizing this, I had a colleague who was really from the interfaith world who was working with me on this. And I noticed that there were very few women who were in senior positions of leadership in the religious institutions. And so we had very few women at the summit. And I also noticed that it was dominated by Abrahamic voices, and that the Dharma traditions were very much underrepresented, and nobody even noticed. And since I myself was fully engrossed in studying the Hindu tradition, I just thought this was very odd. So the summit happened. It was a success, but this lack really bothered me, the lack of women's voices and the lack of the Dharma traditions. And so that led me to go back to the UN, to Secretary General, and ask to do a follow-up summit of women religious leaders, which Kofi Annan was very agreeable to that idea. And I made sure there was a balance between East and West, and that really began my interfaith work.
Mm-hmm. Dena, I wanted to ask, you mentioned that your guru is Paramahansa Yogananda, and of course, I'm familiar with him from reading Autobiography of a Yogi, but I should also say my wife and I rented a house right next to where he once lived in Encinitas, and as a result, I spent a lot of time over at the SRF gardens and got to know a number of the monks and some of the nuns. And I'm curious, you mentioned the lack of women leadership in a lot of spiritual traditions, which is obvious, but in the Self-Realization Fellowship that was founded by Paramahansa Yogananda, the past leader, who was in a leadership position for many, many years, and the current leader of that organization is a woman. Why do you think they have been more open to women leadership than some other spiritual groups? Was it from his teaching, or?
Well, Yogananda was really clear about having Madhya Mata in particular, but also he wanted, it wasn't set in stone, but his vision was that women would lead the organization. But the men actually do go out and do most of the teaching, the male swamis, and some devotees have protested and said, we'd like to hear from some of the nuns. And SRF has adapted, and there are a few nuns now who go out. But I think in India, this is one of the things that drew me to India early on, is that there have always been women saints, women, we have Amma, We have Anandamoy Ma, who was passed away, in the 80s. So there have always been women who are revered, and then you have the whole. When I got into this because of women religious leaders, but soon found that the problem is in the theology. In Hinduism, the divine is represented as both male and female. There's a divine mother. So all these faces of divine mother, Parvati, Durga, Lakshmi, Saraswati, that's not true in the Abrahamic traditions. The divine is portrayed as male. And this is a source of the problems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And yet, to be fair, in India, most of the organizational leadership in the spiritual world is male. But women do rise, these exceptional women throughout their history. What did you find when you organized women religious and spiritual leaders? How is it different from what we had been accustomed to when it was mostly men?
Well, the first summit that we did, it was very contentious because this was in 2000. First time religious leaders are coming to the General Assembly of the UN, and there was so much protocol. And we had to think, does the Shiite Muslim speak before the Sunni? If the Shiite speaks first, Sunni will get upset. Which rabbi do you bring in? All these things that had to be followed to the T. It was really a nightmare in terms of, all the protocol. And somebody couldn't speak longer. We had to give everybody the exact amount of time. With the Women's Summit, there was none of that. There was no protocol. People were just happy to have a stage and a place to speak. And it was just so much more harmonious. There was no competition because, there is competition among the religions, the institutional religions. And because the women are not leaders of those institutions, they just kind of don't go there.
How interesting.
Interesting. Dena, when did you first make the bridge into spiritual ecology? What is spiritual ecology? How would you define it? And what prompted you to go into that area?
So we had been dealing to the early years of the 2000s with peace building and bringing spiritual leaders, not just women. I mean, this movement was founded by women, but it really was quite balanced in terms of gender. And then in the year 2009, I think it was, we got invited to bring a delegation of spiritual leaders to the United Nations Climate Conference in Copenhagen. And that was the first time we were participating in a climate conference. And that was the Obamas had just been elected, and he was there. It was a very big deal because there was the hope that there would be an agreement that would come out of that. And we found chaos, complete breakdown at the governmental level. We had about 25 spiritual leaders, men and women, beautifully balanced, East and West. And the NGO community was really angry. They were angry that there could be no movement, that there was breakdown. And so you had marches, you had anger, and we just held a spiritual energy. We had a lot of sessions going on at that time, just talking about how we had to connect with the earth. We had to love the earth again. It was that simple. Yes, agreements had to be made, carbon trades and whatever, but basically it was about changing consciousness, and that nothing would change until we changed consciousness. And people were so happy to hear that message. And that was the beginning for us of focusing on changing the way we interact with and understand our relationship with the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
Dena, when you have gatherings and one of the things you brought to the table was to make sure the presence of women was a feature of these interfaith gatherings. How did the male spiritual leaders and religious leaders react to the presence on an equal footing of all the women, and how are they different from the way they were when it was all men?
I would say that the men that we reach out to and work with were so pleased We had when we did our second summit, which was at the UN in Geneva, the Palais des Nations, which was the Global Peace Initiative of women, religious and spiritual leaders, giving women a platform. We had so many requests from men to come, and so we had about a quarter to a third of the participants were men religious leaders, and I think that there's great frustration among many men of the system that prevents the voices of women, the energies of women of coming forth. So we have found some of our greatest supporters to be some of the men. Mm-hmm. And we don't necessarily work with the institutional leaders. We work with spiritual figures, with people who have a strong spiritual presence and who are spiritual teachers.
Dena, do you make a distinction between spirituality and religion, and if so, how do you make that distinction?
Well, there's some people who have institutional responsibilities. They may not have a great spiritual presence, but they are committed to their institution, and their job is institutional, to see the growth of the institution, that the institution follows its doctrines or whatever. Mm-hmm. And they could be cardinals and bishops and rabbis, chief rabbis. We've worked with all of them, but I find that they have little leeway to stray from what the official line is. And so we work with people who have a deep spiritual practice and have some spiritual realization. Those are the people we seek to find. Their commitment is not to their institution, but to helping people with their own spiritual development.
Very good. But there must be some considerable overlap between institutional leaders and people who have a deep spiritual presence. Is that right?
Yes, we've worked with many of the monastics at Self-Realization Fellowship, or a number of them, and they are religious leaders, and we've worked with swamis, mm-hmm. and their work is not institutional necessarily, right. but spiritual unfolding.
Right. Dena, what do you think it would take for a religion like Catholicism, like Orthodox Judaism or conservative Judaism in the United States, to really change in regard to its women participation? Let's look at Catholicism. Right now you have Pope Francis, an amazingly progressive pope, doing things and saying things that no other popes have ever said, yet the organization remains totally sexist because, it's all run by men, all the bishops, all the cardinals, the pope. Do you think there's anything in this generation that can be done to change that?
I think these institutions will make themselves irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
I think they're doing themselves in. I mean, the people who have power do not want to yield power, and there may be some changes they will make, but at the end of the day, are they still about holding on to their power? The Catholic Church is a very, very wealthy institution,
mm-hmm.
global institution. And in many ways, it's been an oppressive institution. And this Pope has certainly shown a different face. He's got humility. He's, willing to open up a little bit and be more inclusive. But is he going to go through the transformation that is absolutely needed in our time? I doubt it. And then he'll become irrelevant. I mean, we need to really evolve and let go ways of thinking that are hampering us. In order for our species to survive, we have to adapt new ways of thinking that are much more enlightened. And those who can't come along, I'm afraid, will make themselves mm-hmm. irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Dena, when we asked about the origins of your work, you said that UN summit. There were two realizations. One was the absence of women. The other was the predominance of the Abrahamic faith, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and the lesser participation of what we think of as the Eastern traditions, or mainly the traditions that were born in India, the Dharmic traditions. And you made a concerted effort to balance that out. What did you find when suddenly there were Buddhist monks and swamis and yogis and people like that at the table. How did that change interfaith communications?
I think it's of critical importance because it opens it up into a global conversation. There's so much baggage within the Abrahamic family that any conversation that is just with the Abrahamic family gets eventually caught up in the historical issues between those groups. And we seem to go in circles. I've been many conferences where it's just Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and there's still a lot of angst and anger, and yes, we've got a lot to tolerate each other, but they don't seem to move beyond into recognizing that the consciousness evolves, and we can't any longer have this competition of which religion is right. The Dharma traditions do not have that. You don't hear the Buddhists or the Hindus saying, well, we have the only truth. You're only going to find salvation through us. And I think that's an old way of thinking, and most of the Christians that we work with have moved beyond that, but the institutions have not moved beyond that. And it's been a huge burden on the human family and caused so much suffering, this battle between which religion is right. And I think we are called to evolve beyond that, and bringing in the Dharma traditions helps move that conversation beyond that.
It's amazing how many.
Dennis?
Go ahead.
I noticed something similar in my interfaith exposures, and one of the things I noticed is that when Hindus and Buddhists and to a certain extent Taoists are at the table, there becomes more of an emphasis on the inner life of spirituality and the dimension that we think of as spiritual practice, and less about dogma and history and those kind of arguments. Did you notice that as well?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's about spiritual practice for growth, and how the human community can grow in ways that will, advance society. And I think by bringing in the Dharma tradition, some of this is catching on, because spiritual practices from the East are now being adapted. I know rabbis who just teach other rabbis how to meditate, do Vipassana. And so I think that there's been a very positive influence by this focus on inner development.
Yeah, those religions emphasizing more experiential side of religion, of spirituality than the scriptural. But I wanted to ask you about another group. You mentioned before about coming back to loving the earth, and I'm wondering in your conferences if you have included indigenous people from North America and their spiritual leaders. And so that question, and also what is their attitude toward women and leadership in their spiritual groups?
Well, we began working with an indigenous leader from the Sioux tribe about 5 years ago, and he at first looked at us as just another white group. He really didn't get who we were. So I brought him to India to a big conference we did on the theme of Dharma, and he fell in love with India, and he so got that because I think that indigenous people who don't have exposure to the Eastern traditions tend to lump it all together as, part of the other. But he really fell in love with the whole Vedic worldview. So then he invited us to bring some Buddhist and Hindu leaders to Pine Ridge, which we did last year. And that was a beautiful exchange. I mean, the first thing some of the elders said there is they were happy to meet a real Indian.
Yeah, it was just Indians going to India.
So now we're working within we sent a group out to Standing Rock to be there. We've just gotten the report back from Standing Rock, and now we're planning a dialogue between Native American elders and some of the contemplative leaders that we work with for March. I think that what's happened at Standing Rock is monumental. It grew bigger than the pipeline, and it became about honoring the world view, which is not just in the Native American tribes; it's also in the Vedic tradition and many of the older traditions about treating the earth like your mother and seeing the rivers as living entities and the forests and mountains as beings and not commodities. And we're at a very interesting time now because we have the election phenomenon, and then we have Standing Rock phenomenon. The fact that we had so many people who went to Standing Rock and had spiritual awakening experiences there, and it was all love energy, prayer, meditations, songs, celebrations. And so we've had two things going on at the same time, opposites almost.
Right.
People who left Standing Rock just wanted to get back there. And they felt an intense spiritual energy. And from what we read, people were saying that this was a response to the Earth's call. And this has to be a wake-up now. So we've got these two realities going on. It's going to be interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
How they interact.
As we record this on December 8th, 2016, we should add that while Standing Rock is going on, and I just learned a lot from you about what had been going on there. It wasn't just a matter of the pipeline and politics, but at the same time, this what you just described was going on. We had somebody nominated to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, who represents the other extreme of the environmental outlook in the world. What do you foresee coming up with and how are the groups that you're associated with responding?
We know that there's a whole undercurrent now that's building. And I think the messages have to be clear. We're talking about sacred earth now. We have to reclaim that understanding and that sacred relationship with the earth. And the more the other forces try to destroy that, the stronger this movement will become. Mm-hmm. And the only way I can understand what's happening on the negative side is it will strengthen the other.
Right. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a question, Dena, about your own energies and resources going into accomplishing just that. You can go out and talk to people about what's the right thing to do and about Mother Earth and all that. And some people will hear it and then it'll also fall on deaf ears. Or you can go out and encourage people and teach people how to engage in spiritual practices which will raise their consciousness, and then some would say, then naturally they will understand and intuitively grasp the importance of Mother Earth and taking care of her. Where is it better for you to put your energies into developing people's spirituality, or going out and actually talking to them directly, regardless of where they are spiritually?
I think it's raising people's consciousness spiritually. We organized a conference a few weeks back on the future of Dharma in America, and we brought together Dharma teachers, meditation teachers, and the purpose was we can't be teaching meditation as just stress reduction. It has to be about transformation.
Right.
And so we need to bring in the concept of Dharma. You can't separate spiritual practice from this understanding of transformation to uphold Dharma. What does it mean to uphold Dharma? What does it mean to live a life in harmony with Dharma? What is Dharma? That has to be central to any spiritual practice. And because spiritual practice is becoming so popular, or early yoga, meditation, and people are buying it because it does reduce stress and it gives people a sense of peace and whatever, can we take them to the next step? Because I think the change in consciousness automatically then brings a lot of things. An understanding of how to the consciousness in terms of how we relate to the earth and the natural world. And so just to talk to people, you can talk, we don't have time, really. We can spend the next 30 years just trying to convince people.
Right.
Only the change in consciousness will do it. That's what's needed now.
Now, that's a good segue. I was going to ask about another of the organizations you're involved with or lead. Another is the Contemplative Alliance. Is that still operative? And how does that play into these other activities you do?
The Contemplative Alliance is actually a main part of our work, and most of the gatherings that we do here in the U.S., we would do them under the name of the Contemplative Alliance. The Global Peace Initiative of Women developed 15 years ago really was a lot of our peace efforts internationally. We've worked in many of the hot spots. But when we decided to focus on the U.S., we wanted to bring contemplatives together for this spiritual transformation. I've traveled the world, and I feel that there's great potential in America because there's so many practitioners now. Mm-hmm. Dharma has really taken root in America. But it hasn't yet congealed into enough of a movement that it could really flip things. But I believe that could not be far off, and we can't allow ourselves to get discouraged by what appears to be, in a throwback to darker times.
Right.
That's a temporary thing.
Dena, in your life, do you take time every day?
And that was a positive.
Right. Do you take time every day to engage in spiritual practice? What's your daily routine? How do you keep that balance?
Well, I meditate first thing in the morning for an hour. I try to do a little bit in the evening, but that's not as regular as the morning. And then I try to have a few hours on the weekend. Mm-hmm. So I get the most benefit from longer meditations. A couple of times a year, I'll go and retreat and do maybe 5-6 hours a day of meditation, and that's how I recharge myself. I couldn't manage without meditation, and I use the Kriya Yoga practices that Yogananda taught. And then I do reading of some of the texts, and so I listen to chanting a lot. Mm-hmm. So my mind is in the spiritual practice, I would say, for a few hours a day.
Excellent. So you're a good example of a contemplative activist, because there's many people who are activists who don't have that inner life and the opportunity to rejuvenate and transform on a regular basis. And then, of course, there are many contemplatives who are disengaged with the world, and you seem to be a great karma yoga example.
I can't understand how you can be disengaged. I do believe that meditation is an action. So, you're meditating, and there are practices the Buddhists do where they offer the merit. Mm-hmm. So the merit of your meditation you offer it to the world. So I think, and I've often said that the yogis, hidden away, are probably what's holding this planet together right now.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because I think there's a lot of grace coming through.
Dena, I have one last question for you, and that is my co-host here, Phil Goldberg, as we speak, is writing a biography of Paramahansa Yogananda, and with the full cooperation of the Self-Realization Fellowship. What advice do you have for him as somebody who is a student and disciple of Yogananda? Phil did not ask me to ask this question.
I did. I'm shocked.
Well, what I would say is there are many dimensions of Yogananda. There's the outer story and there's the inner story. Mm-hmm. And each devotee has an inner story of life-saving things that have happened to them. Mm-hmm. And it becomes a very personal relationship where between you and the guru, where there are moments when what can you say? He comes again and again to pull you out of the dark. And it's these inner stories that I think are so precious. And so I hope in your book you can capture some of them.
We'll see. Dena, thanks for the advice, the literary advice. Our listeners, I hope, have gotten a good sense of all the wonderful work you're doing in the world. We've mentioned a few of the projects and organizations you're involved in. Did we leave anything out? Is there anything you'd like to bring to the attention of our listeners? And if somebody is inspired by what they've heard, are there ways for them to be involved with what you're doing?
Yes, they can check out our website and email me. It's www.gpiw.org. I want to leave with a closing thought, and that thought is, when I work with the grassroots people around this country, I realize how much phenomenal spiritual energy has been unfolding here in this country. And I think that we're reaching a moment where it's going to show itself in a very positive way. And so many people are discouraged now in the last few weeks, myself included. We have to work not to get discouraged and to see that there's a deeper purpose to this unfolding. And we have to manifest. Now it's time to manifest, to bring our spiritual energy to the fore and help something greater manifest.
Great. Well, thank you so very much.
Sounds like a good way to close.
Yeah. We wish you great success, continued success in your work, and that we hope to have you back on the show in the near future, so you can continue to let us know your progress. And I think we're all in this together, and I think your message really resonates today and will continue to resonate in our society and culture. So thank you so very much. Phil, anything
Wonderful.
else?
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Okay, Dena, thank you so much, and keep up the good work. We'll be in touch.
Okay, great. Talk to you soon.
Bye.